Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 44, and we're going to talk about who makes more, men or women. And we're going to sort of put to the side all other gender issues and interpretation and subjectivities and just focus on the dichotomy of men or women. And I think that used to be a popular discussion. And now with all of the nouveau gender discussions, I think it becomes kind of awkward to talk about men or women. But I'm not in that discussion anymore, so I can just simply reduce it to men or women. This is also the first episode where I'm using a new mic. As I explained in the last episode, I have really bad hearing, and so I can tell that there is a difference in the recording between the mic I was using before and this one, but I really can't. I prefer the way that it recorded before. I can hear it a lot better, but I guess for audiophiles and people who are not deaf, this is more preferred. So there it is. Anyway, I will be referencing the work of Thomas Sowell throughout this episode. And if you've never heard of him, he is an African-American scholar who originally was a Marxist and then took a summer internship working for the government in the minimum wage office. And after the summer was over, he was a free market proponent. So basically, the way that you get rid of all your pro-Marxist ideology beliefs, you go work for the government and you get jaded pretty quickly. Because he actually wanted to try to solve issues, understand problems, and most people, as we explained before, the incentives are all wrong in government. You have to perpetuate the problem so that you can keep your job. Interestingly, when I was a grad student trying to study race and eventually have race as an important part of my final dissertation, my first race instructor told me never, ever, ever to read Thomas Sowell. She made me swear, and she really did not like Thomas Sowell. So I thought Thomas Sowell was white. And it was very surprising to me when I finally saw a picture of him that he was African-American and that he was a Marxist. And even though he studied under Milton Friedman, who I will be mentioning later in this episode, he did not come to the free market by listening to Friedman. Anyway, I got to read Thomas Sowell after I got my PhD, where it didn't matter anymore, right? So no one could tell me what I could or couldn't read. And so I just read whatever the trail, revealed. So I would start digging for information, and along the way, I would read Thomas Sowell. And I realized why my first race instructor told me never to read him, because he basically debunked everything that she was saying. And I think that really annoyed her. But in any case, Thomas Sowell is awesome in the way that he collects data. He must have people working with him, or I don't know what he does and how much time and resources is required to be able to collect all this information. But he collects a massive amount of information, and then he processes all this information to reveal interesting things. Things that people will say as fact, he reveals statistically through the information that he collected that it's not exactly what people think it is. This episode is going to be based on information that is found in Thomas Sowell's book, Economic Facts and Fallacies. That entire book is just, actually, everything that he writes is just so readable. Yeah, it's just very enjoyable to read. In any case, he points out that the wage disparity between men and women, and depending on who you ask, it's different, right? So sometimes it's 70%, right? 70 cents on the dollar, 66 cents on the dollar, but it's significantly less. So if you compare uh, the average wage of a woman in the United States with the average wage of a man in the United States, you'll see that women make less. But he points out right away that this is kind of problematic because these are, and I'm going to mix in some of my own terminology, these are broad racializations. And the assumption is that they're all the same. But this is not generally the case. If we take a closer look, as all generalities, each individual within that generality is going to be different. And so you can't compare people who are going through different situations, different experiences, and pretend that they are all going through the same experience. In other words, there are certain factors which changes how much a person makes over the course of their career. And the two characteristics that he wanted to highlight are the two characteristics which affect men and women in exactly the opposite way. So in other words, we're not even going to look and consider the fact that a lot of jobs that the women choose are not the same as the jobs that men would choose, that there is a difference in the pay scale between men and women. We're also not really going to think about or consider or factor in the fact that a lot of men will work longer hours than women, right? So it's not that no women work long hours. It's not that at all. But generally, looking at the entire racialization, men have a tendency of working more. So this is most pronounced when we factor in two racializations. I call them racializations. He just says, if we consider two factors and how they affect men and women in exactly opposite ways, and we factor them out, then let's examine to see who makes more, men or women. The two characteristics are getting married and having children. So if a man or a woman becomes a parent, or if they get married at any point in their life, it's going to affect a man positively. It will affect a woman negatively. So even if we just assume a married relationship where two people get married, they have a child. When two people get married, and we're talking about heterosexual couples here, okay, and you can make your extrapolations for same-sex couples, but we're just going to focus on what Thomas Sowell said, because this is basically the argument that is made that women make less than men. It's a binary argument that's made. But marriage affects men in a way that they work more, right? They take on more responsibility. And women generally become more domestic. Even in my case, before I got married, my wife basically told me that it's all about her career. And as soon as we got married, she was like, yeah, I'll just stay at home and raise the kids. And so a lot of people who don't think that they would be like that do end up taking these traditional, so-called traditional marriage roles. So men generally tend to work more. For example, I have 2 full-time jobs, and my wife stayed at home and took care of the kids. So men generally will make more than women because of that. Also, having children affect women and men differently. So whereas some women will opt to put their kids in daycare, many women choose to raise the kids themselves. Even in our family, we did the math. And if my wife did get a job, it would just basically be enough to pay for daycare. So she decided, and we decided that she was just simply going to take care of the kids and devote all of her time and energy there. So that becomes a generality as well, that men and women who get married and have children, men generally benefit, which means that they begin to make more, and women begin to make less. So you can't, therefore, compare married men and women with each other and say it's the same situation. So what he says is you have to compare like with like, right? You have to compare people in similar situations to get a more accurate kind of sense of whether men or women are getting paid differently. So if we factor out married men and women and men and women who have ever had children, right? So we only compare men and women who are never married, never had children. You will see that women make as much as men and sometimes more than men, right? And so it's really interesting that, uh, that when you factor out the two things which affect men and women differently, women make as much as men and sometimes make more. And so when that comes out, I basically ask everyone in class, okay, so now that we know that women make more, come on, guys, let's go outside to the center of campus and start protesting, unequal pay, and demand equal wages with women. And I've never had a student say, yeah, let's do this. Most men, when they hear that, they're like, oh, all right, that's interesting. But I'd rather watch the football game than do this or that. It's kind of an interesting thing. And then I bring up the fact that if you look at the animal world, the animal kingdom or the insect world, you'll see that most of the gender that often does the heavy lifting are the females, right? So if you look at a bee colony, they're all females there. And the only males, the drones, they're only needed when the queen needs to mate. Other than that, they're just a waste of space. They just sit around all day, drink nectar, eat up the hive's resources. And so when winter comes around, you just kill off all the drones. You don't need them. So all of the bees in a beehive are female. Female lions do most of the hunting, and then after something is caught, then the male lions come in and start eating. So you see this thing where men generally kind of like, yeah, let all the women do the work. So it's not so surprising then that women make as much or sometimes even more than men. How is this possible? Well, if you look at society, also increased automation enables women to take over jobs that only men used to do, right? So jobs which required a lot of physical energy, well, if you introduce a forklift or a tractor, see, now women can do a lot of the farming and lifting that previously only men could do because of the physical differences. So where there was automation, women pushed men out of work. An interesting opposite phenomena is school teacher. Because of unions and all of their activism that they went through, teacher salaries started to rise far more than they should have, which made those jobs now attractive to men. And so you start seeing men going into the teaching profession, especially in the lower middle, elementary, junior high, high school level, because now they're paying as much as what they would get at normally male-dominated jobs. So men, because they were pushed out of certain occupations by women traditionally, not so much now, but traditionally, then men had to go find jobs that women didn't want to do, right? So typically today, you still see certain occupations dominated by men, and very few women are protesting and crying discrimination in those fields. For example, sewer work, and I might have mentioned this before, but something like 94% of all sewer workers are men. And the 6% that are women, they're usually doing office work. And it has something to do with smells. Bad smells affect women more than it does men. So men have a higher tolerance for that. And so more men are sewer workers. You don't see women complaining about that. Military used to be dominated by men, but because they've lowered so many of the standards, the physical requirements, that more women now can enter the military. But I've seen videos where they have the what is it, when they do hand-to-hand combat training, women often get destroyed. Now, I know what you're saying. I'm being a sexist. No, I'm just sort of being matter of fact. I know that there are women who could totally rip me in half. I know that. I watched the CrossFit Championship Games, and some of the winners there. I mean, the women are just they're monsters. Okay, and they can just totally, by looking at me, they could probably split me in half. But those women also have probably no interest in joining the military. Um, I remember I watched the Physical 100, which was a Korean, sort of fitness competition thing. It was sort of like Survivor, except it was in Korea, and a lot of bodybuilders were there, including women. And some of the women, they wanted to challenge men. And it was interesting that I think most of the time when it was a strength based challenge, they would lose, even though all they ever did was exercise. But getting back to pay. So some of my students, when I would point this out, they really didn't like this. They were like, wow, that's not fair. You know, getting married and having children shouldn't affect women that way. And I was like, well, now, if they were forced choices, right? Like if society or the government said, women, you have to get married, you have to have children, okay, well, maybe we can have a discussion. But the reality is that pretty much most of the time, right? So I know someone is going to say, what about rape, or what about arranged marriages, right? Look, this is generalization, just like the way this information was produced. So for the most part, right, most women get married because they want to get married. Most women have children because they want to have children. And so these are free choices. And so what people don't take into account is that over time, because of the general tendency of women to get married and have children, especially when they can, that is part of the cost. So the cost of getting married means that you're going to make less. The cost of having children means you're probably going to make less over the course of your lifetime. And so people look at that, and some of the females in my class, they get really upset. But then I'm like, but see, there's a trade-off there. In exchange for the lower wages, your life perhaps might be more fulfilling because now you have a family. And believe me, I've met a lot of people who have told me straight up that they believed all this ideology, and they've gotten older, they don't have children, and they regret it. They regret it. And so that is part of the cost. So they were able to make as much as men, but now they don't have any children. So they've told me that they regretted that. And so it is a trade-off. If you're going to pursue higher wages, you're going to make certain sacrifices. And so there's that. If you say, no, I don't think that that cost should be a part of it. And so even if you are married or have kids, even if you work fewer hours, right, you don't do all of that extra accreditation and certification work, specialization, it doesn't matter. You should make the same. Well, see, now we're talking about injustice, except in the other way, right? So you do all this extra work and you're not properly compensated for it. So we have to realize that choices have consequences. There are trade-offs, opportunity costs. You can describe it in any way you want, but the consequences of some of the choices that we make are going to be lower wages or they're higher wages. Now, the thing about creating this problem in the first place is the perception that social scientific study, right, not scientific study, but social scientific study, is somehow objective. And so they do these studies and surveys, and they tell everyone, hey, see, this is what we came up with. It's objective. It's the truth. And that has degenerated, but not that far, to a meme culture where people don't have the patience to do the research, do the work. They'll see it in a meme and they'll say, well, that must be what is true. And so they'll see something that is that sounds plausible, but largely inaccurate. And then they'll repeat it as if it's true. And this is basically what happens all the time now. So who has the patience to even listen for 15 minutes to show that what they thought was true is just simply a manipulation of perception, a manipulation of subjectivity? Very few people have that kind of patience. And maybe it's also why people these days are saying that logic or math, the Enlightenment, these things are racist, because they want to preserve their religious fanaticism to an idea. They want to make that science, right? So what you begin to see is a repeat of what had happened earlier, a few hundred years ago, where scientific belief, so-called, became a religious belief. And you're seeing that happening all over again. So the flow of information, the freedom of speech, the competition of ideas, these things are very, very important. And just to follow up, we talked about Nigel Farage in an earlier episode, and I just saw on the news today that the CEO of, Coots, and then their parent company, had to step down because what she did in kicking him out was actually in violation of the trust that banks want to cultivate with their customers. And she was her resignation was accepted because she let her personal preferences interfere with the operations of the business. In other words, arbitrary discrimination is punished in any way. So if you favor male workers over female workers, and without regard to the cost and who does a better job, you will probably be punished. If you prefer women over men, right, for the same reasons, and it's arbitrary, it's just a matter that you want to hire women, although men would do a better job, over time, your company will be punished. And so what is the best policy? Who are the best candidates should be a case-by-case kind of situation. Back in the day, Asians were heavily discriminated against. But what do? Did they protest? No, they looked for jobs that no one was going to impede them, right? So we talked about this before, but after the Transcontinental Railroad was built and they were all sent packing, many of them settled in California, where they faced even more discrimination. So the only occupations where no one really cared if they engaged in it or not was laundry services and restaurants. And so it's not so surprising that there were, at least when I was a kid, there were a lot of Chinese laundry services, but there are many Chinese restaurants. Almost everywhere there's Chinese people, you will see Chinese restaurants, right? And so that's the thing. You can either be upset that you're being discriminated against, or you find opportunity that meets your abilities, your creativity, your goals better, right? So it's you try to take advantage or work the existing rules to your advantage. And so a lot of Asians today, what they do is excel in academics. It's not because of some racial reason that Asians are somehow smarter in school. No, it's because of the choices that they have made, right? They forego the athletics. They forego a lot of these after school activities. They forego vacations and go into a lot of these, supplemental study sessions, right? And so the consequences of choices is what yields the results that we are observing. And you can't say, well, I never studied, but I still should be able to score as well as everybody else. It's just absolutely ludicrous. So there it is. Women make as much as men and sometimes more. That's what the data says. So that's it for this episode. I will talk to you in the next.